Jed Callahan had lived with ghosts for 3 years, but the one he found breathing in his barn during the spring storm would change everything. The brand on her thigh said she belonged to someone else, Wyoming Territory, 1885. His ranch stood isolated for a reason. After Ellen's murder, Jed preferred the company of cattle to people. He'd built a life of routine, watching distant mountains change seasons while he remained unchanged. The approaching storm had driven him to check the barn's roof, not to find a half-dead woman in the hay. Her fever-bright eyes widened at his approach. "Don't send me back," she whispered. Then he saw it clearly in the lantern light. Owned by Graves, burned into her flesh. Graves. The name from Ellen's bloodied land deed. No coincidence. Hoofbeats approached through the rain as Jed's hand moved to his revolver. Whoever had branded a human being as property had also taken his wife. Today, isolation ended. Justice began. The fence wire bit into Jed Callahan's calloused hands, a familiar pain he welcomed like an old friend. Dawn painted the Wyoming grasslands in shades of pale gold and green, the mountains to the west still capped with late spring snow. 3 years since they'd put Ellen in the ground, and still the sunrise brought no warmth. Coffee steamed in the tin mug balanced on a fence post, strong and black as the thoughts he'd learned to keep to himself. His ranch stood like an island in a sea of grass, exactly how he preferred it. Isolation meant no questions about the scar along his jawline, no pitying glances when Ellen's name surfaced in conversation. A meadowlark called from atop a weathered fence post, its song carrying across the empty range. Jed paused in his work, allowing himself one moment that might have been peace if he remembered what peace felt like. The distant mountains remained, while everything else changed. He took comfort in their constancy. The spring storm building on the horizon caught his attention, dark clouds gathering with the promise of much-needed rain. His gaze swept across his modest holdings, a small herd of cattle, the barn that needed patching, a ranch house grown too large for one man. All of it a reminder of plans made with Ellen, futures stolen by a bullet, and a forged land deed. He gathered his tools and drained the last of his coffee. The barn roof had been leaking, and the approaching storm would be a good test of his repairs. As Jed crossed the yard, the wind carried a sound that didn't belong, something between a whimper and a moan coming from inside the barn. His hand moved instinctively to the Colt on his hip. The barn door creaked on worn hinges as Jed entered, Winchester rifle now in hand. Dust motes danced in the shafts of light that penetrated the weathered boards. The horses shifted nervously in their stalls, sensing his tension. That sound again, human, pained, coming from the back storage area where he kept hay and supplies. "Show yourself," he called, his voice rough from disuse. When no answer came, he moved forward carefully, each step measured and silent, as his cavalry days had taught him. A pile of hay in the corner shifted slightly. Jed aimed the Winchester and approached, then stopped short at what he found. A woman lay half buried in the hay, her dress torn and muddied, dark hair matted with blood from a gash on her forehead. But it was the mark on her exposed thigh that froze his blood. A brand, not yet fully healed, the letters stark against her skin. Owned by M. Graves. Her eyes fluttered open, fever-bright and terrified. She recoiled at the sight of his rifle. "Please," she whispered, voice cracking with thirst. "Don't send me back." Jed lowered his weapon slowly. "Graves? Marcus Graves?" She nodded weakly, then winced at the movement. "He owns half the territory." "Says he owns me, too." Jed's mind flashed to the land deed he'd found clutched in Ellen's hand, stained with her blood. The name signed at the bottom had been Marcus Graves, a man he'd never met, yet whose signature had appeared on documents dated when Jed had still owned the north pasture. "You're safe here for now," he said, kneeling beside her. He offered his canteen, supporting her head as she drank. "I'm Jed Callahan." "Annabelle," she managed between sips. "Annabelle Wells." The sudden sound of approaching hoofbeats cut through the drumming of rain on the barn roof. Annabelle's fingers dug into his arm with surprising strength. "They found me," she whispered, terror making her voice childlike. Graves' men always find what belongs to him. Jed moved to the barn door, peering through a crack between the weathered boards. 3 riders approached through the rain, the lead man's duster marked with Graves's cattle brand, the same brand now burned into human flesh. He glanced back at Annabelle, shivering in the hay despite the spring warmth. In 3 years of isolation, he'd managed to avoid Graves and his operations, no small feat in a territory where the man's influence seemed to grow by the month. Turning her over would be the simplest choice, the safest choice. "There's a storage space beneath the floorboards," Jed said instead, moving quickly to shift a heavy trunk. "Used to hide supplies from raiders. Should hide you, too." Annabelle stared at him, uncertainty warring with desperate hope. "Why would you risk this? You don't know me." Jed's hand went to his vest pocket where he kept Ellen's locket, the one item he couldn't bear to put away with her other things. Inside was a scrap of the land deed he'd found with her body, evidence the sheriff had dismissed as irrelevant to a robbery gone wrong. "Graves took something from me, too," he said simply, helping her into the narrow space. "My wife found something about his operations." Next day she was dead. Understanding dawned in Annabelle's eyes. "Then we have something in common." Jed replaced the floorboards as the hoofbeats grew louder. "Don't make a sound, no matter what happens." He closed the trunk over the hidden space and straightened just as the barn door rattled with a heavy knock. His hand settled on his revolver as he moved to answer, knowing his 3 years of carefully constructed peace had just ended. Some ghosts demanded justice before they could rest. The approaching riders circled Jed's ranch house like wolves, their eyes scanning every shadow. Jed leaned against his barn door, Colt revolver visible but not yet drawn. "Something I can help you with, gentlemen?" he called out, measuring the distance to each man. 3 riders, all armed, wearing the Circle G brand on their dusters. The lead man, a weathered cowhand with a thick mustache, tipped his hat. "Name's Miller, riding for Mr. Graves, looking for a woman, dark hair, city clothes." "Has seen anyone matching that description?" "Can't say that I have," Jed replied, his face betraying nothing. "Don't get many visitors out this way. That's how I prefer it." Miller's eyes narrowed. "Mind if we take a look in your barn?" "I mind considerably." Jed's hand rested closer to his revolver. "This is private property. Mr. Graves has a legal interest in this woman. She's unwell, needs looking after. If I see anyone, I'll be sure to let the sheriff know." Miller laughed, a harsh sound without humor. "You do that. Sheriff knows Mr. Graves is concerned about his property." The emphasis on the last word made Jed's stomach turn. "We'll be back if we don't find her elsewhere." They rode off, dust trailing behind them. Jed watched until they disappeared over the ridge before returning to the barn. "They're gone," he said, removing the floorboards. Annabelle blinked up at him, fear still evident in her eyes. "But they'll be back." "We need to move." "Where?" she asked, taking his offered hand to climb out. "To see an old friend," Jed replied, helping her to her feet. If anyone can help us, it's Hawk. He hadn't spoken to Hawk Thompson in nearly 2 years, but if anyone understood tracking and hiding, it was the Arapaho scout who taught Jed everything he knew about survival. The journey to Hawk's cabin took 3 hours, following game trails to avoid the main road. Annabelle rode behind Jed, her arms wrapped around his waist for stability. Every wince when the horse jostled her branded thigh tightened something in Jed's chest. Hawk's cabin stood nestled against a rocky outcropping, nearly invisible until you were upon it. The old scout appeared in the doorway before they'd fully arrived, rifle resting casually in his arms. 3 years you don't visit, Hawk said, his weathered face impassive. Must be trouble. The worst kind, Jed admitted, helping Annabelle dismount. Hawk's dark eyes took in the situation without comment. He simply nodded and gestured them inside. The cabin was spare but comfortable, walls adorned with items that blended Arapaho traditions with frontier practicality. Hawk examined Annabelle's injuries with gentle hands and knowing eyes, applying a poultice to her brand that brought immediate relief. "Graves did this?" he asked, his voice tight with controlled anger. Annabelle nodded. "I worked as a secretary for his mining interests. When I discovered discrepancies in the land records, she swallowed hard. He said he needed to teach me my place." Jed's hands curled into fists. "He's forging land deeds. Ellen found evidence before she died." "Not just deeds," Hawk said, moving to a shelf and retrieving a worn newspaper. "Ruby at the saloon says 3 families lost their ranches last month. Graves produces documents. They lose everything. 1 man protested, found dead the next day." Jed studied the newspaper. "We need more information, and I need to get into town without being recognized." "I can help with both," Hawk said, retrieving a leather satchel. "But you won't like where we need to go next." "Ruby's saloon," Jed guessed, remembering the woman who'd once helped him track down outlaws. Hawk nodded. "She hears everything, but Graves owns half the town now." Dusk settled over the small town of Elk Creek as Jed, now wearing Hawk's spare clothes and a wide-brimmed hat pulled low, made his way toward Ruby's saloon. Annabelle remained at Hawk's cabin, her brand being treated with the old scout's remedies. The saloon hummed with evening activity, piano notes mingling with conversation and the clink of glasses. Ruby Carson hadn't changed, still commanding her domain from behind the bar, copper hair piled high, sharp eyes missing nothing. Those eyes widened briefly when they landed on Jed, but she recovered quickly, giving no sign of recognition. She served him whiskey when he approached the bar. "Passing through?" she asked casually, wiping the counter. "Looking for work," Jed replied, using their old code. Ruby nodded almost imperceptibly. "Kitchen needs washing up. Follow me." The kitchen doorway led to a small office where Ruby closed the door behind them. "I heard you were dead," she said, arms crossed. "Not for lack of trying," Jed replied. "I need information about Marcus Graves." Ruby's expression hardened. "Dangerous subject. He practically owns this town now." "He branded a woman like cattle," Jed said quietly. "And I think he had Ellen killed." Ruby's composure faltered. "Jesus, Jed, I'm sorry." She moved to a locked cabinet, retrieving a folder. "Martha Wilkins at the general store has been keeping records. Her husband questioned one of Graves's deeds last year. Found him hanging from their porch the next morning." The folder contained a list of properties, dates, and previous owners, all now belonging to Graves. "There's more," Ruby said, hesitation in her voice. She withdrew a folded document from her dress pocket. "Ellen came to see me the day before she died. Left this for safekeeping." Jed's hands trembled as he unfolded the paper, a partial land deed with Ellen's signature and a dark bloodstain across the corner. The name M. Graves was clearly visible, along with a strange patterned seal he'd never seen before. "She said, if anything happened to her, I should find you," Ruby whispered. "She said, the python leaves its mark." Dawn broke over Hawk's cabin as three people gathered around a rough-hewn table, studying the blood-stained document by lamplight. "The python leaves its mark," Jed repeated Ellen's cryptic message, tracing the unusual seal on the land deed. "What does it mean?" Annabelle leaned forward, her dark hair falling across her face. "It's a specialized tool," she said, pointing to the seal's distinctive pattern. "I saw something similar in Graves' office, a cylindrical stamp roller with an intricate design. He called it his python because of how it coiled around the paper." "A custom forgery tool," Hawk nodded, understanding. "Makes identical marks each time." "Ellen discovered it's how he forges deeds," Jed said, pieces clicking into place. "The real deeds have the territorial seal, but his python creates convincing forgeries." Annabelle's eyes brightened with purpose. "Before I escaped, I overheard Graves telling his foreman that the original python is stored in a lockbox at his Cheyenne office. Said it was the only one of its kind. If we could get that tool," Ruby added, "and match it to these forged deeds, we'd have proof of his crimes," Jed finished. Enough for the territorial judge. Hawk spread out a crude map of the territory. 3 days' ride to Cheyenne, following the mountain pass. Graves' men will be watching the main roads. Jed traced the route with his finger. "We'll need supplies, weapons." "I have what you need," Hawk said, moving to a hidden compartment beneath the floorboards. He extracted revolvers, ammunition, and dried provisions. "Graves' men are still searching for Annabelle," Ruby warned. "They've got a description of both of you now." Jed met Annabelle's eyes across the table. "Still want to do this? It's your choice." She touched the healing brand on her thigh, determination hardening her features. "I'm done being anyone's property. When do we leave?" "First light," Jed said. "Time to hunt a python." The mountain trail narrowed between towering pines, forcing Jed and Annabelle to ride single file. 2 days into their journey, the terrain had grown increasingly treacherous, steep slopes to one side, sheer drops to the other. Jed constantly scanned their back trail, tension building between his shoulder blades. "Something's wrong," he murmured, reining his horse to a stop. "Too quiet." Annabelle pulled alongside him, her borrowed clothes and hat making her look like a young cowhand from a distance. "Animals?" "No birds." Jed dismounted, leading his horse to a cluster of boulders. "Get down. Stay low." She followed without question, her movements showing growing confidence. Those Eastern manners had given way to frontier practicality with surprising speed. The rifle shot cracked through the mountain silence an instant later, splintering bark where Jed's head had been moments before. He pushed Annabelle behind a boulder and drew his Winchester in one fluid motion. "2 shooters," he whispered, eyes tracking the ridgeline. "Maybe 3. Another shot ricocheted off stone, sending fragments flying. Annabelle flinched, but remained silent, pressing herself against the rocky shelter. "When I fire, move to those trees," Jed instructed, nodding toward a denser copse 20 yards away. "Ready?" She nodded, eyes wide but determined. Jed fired 3 rapid shots toward the muzzle flash on the ridge, then pivoted to cover the trail behind them. Annabelle darted toward the trees as planned, keeping low. A bullet kicked up dirt at her heels, but she made it to cover. Jed followed in a crouching run, another shot whistling past his ear. From their new position, he could see movement along the ridge. 3 riders repositioning. "Graves men," Annabelle whispered. "Stay here." Jed handed her his revolver. 6 shots. Use them if you need to. Before she could protest, he slipped away, using the terrain to circle behind their attackers. Years of cavalry scouting returned to him, reading the land, moving silently, becoming part of the mountain. The first gunman never saw him coming. Jed's rifle butt connected with the man's temple, dropping him without a sound. The second turned at the noise, but Jed's fist caught him squarely in the jaw. The third man managed to get a shot off, grazing Jed's arm before Jed tackled him to the ground. They struggled briefly before Jed slammed the man's head against a rock, ending the fight. Breathing hard, blood seeping through his sleeve, Jed searched the unconscious men. In the lead rider's pocket, he found a telegram. "Stop them before Cheyenne. The python cannot be found." Evening found them in a small cave, a carefully shielded fire providing minimal warmth. Outside, rain began to fall, obscuring their tracks and providing cover from any additional pursuit. Annabelle gently wrapped Jed's arm with strips torn from her petticoat, her fingers surprisingly steady. "You've done this before," Jed observed. "My father was a doctor in Boston," she replied, tying off the bandage. "I assisted him sometimes, before." Her voice trailed off. "Before Graves," Jed finished, watching her expression. Annabelle nodded, settling beside him near the fire. "My family lost everything in '83. Banking collapse. Father took his own life." Her voice remained steady despite the painful memories. "I came west as a secretary, thinking I could save enough to bring my mother and sister out. Then I discovered Graves's forgeries." "And he branded you for it," Jed said, anger evident in his quiet tone. "His way of ensuring I'd never be believed. Who would take the word of property over a respected businessman?" Bitterness edged her words. "What about you? How did Ellen discover his scheme?" Jed stared into the flames. "She handled our ranch accounts. Started noticing discrepancies in property lines compared to our original deed. Found similar issues with neighboring ranches." He withdrew Ellen's locket from his pocket. "She was gathering evidence when they killed her." Annabelle's hand covered his, warm and unexpectedly comforting. "We'll finish what she started." Jed looked at their joined hands, then at her face, illuminated by firelight. For the first time in 3 years, the hollow space in his chest felt slightly less empty. "Get some rest," he said softly. "We reach Cheyenne tomorrow." Cheyenne bustled with activity, the territorial capital a stark contrast to the wilderness they'd traversed. Dressed in fresh clothes purchased from a general store, Jed and Annabelle blended with the crowds, making their way toward the business district. "That's it," Annabelle whispered, nodding toward a 2-story building with Graves Mining Land Development emblazoned on the window. "His office is upstairs. The safe is behind the painting of San Francisco Harbor." Jed studied the building. "Too many people during daylight. We'll wait until evening." Under cover of darkness, they slipped through the back entrance Annabelle remembered from her employment. The lock yielded to Jed's cavalry-taught skills, and they moved silently up the stairs to Graves's opulent office. True to Annabelle's memory, a large painting of San Francisco Harbor hung behind the massive desk. Jed moved it aside to reveal a wall safe. "Can you open it?" Annabelle whispered. Jed pressed his ear to the safe, fingers working the dial with practiced precision. "Ellen taught me," he explained, sensing her surprise. "Said a rancher's wife should know all his secrets." The safe clicked open, revealing documents, cash, and a polished wooden box. Inside lay a metal cylinder with an intricate raised pattern, the python. "This is it," Annabelle breathed, examining the device. "The pattern matches the seal on the forged deeds exactly." Jed carefully placed it in his saddlebag alongside Ellen's blood-stained document. Evidence that connects Graves to both forgery and murder. As they turned to leave, hoofbeats sounded in the street below. Many hoofbeats. "Graves' men," Jed said, drawing his revolver. "They're surrounding the building." Shadows stretched across Graves' office as Jed counted the men gathering in the street below. 6 riders, all armed, with Miller directing them to positions surrounding the building. "They must have been watching the office," Jed muttered, checking his ammunition. "Waiting for us." Annabelle moved to the window on the opposite side. "There's an alley behind the building. Only 2 men covering it." Jed nodded, impressed by her tactical assessment. "We need a distraction." His eyes fell on Graves' ornate desk with its expensive oil lamp. Within minutes, they had gathered ledgers and loose papers into a pile. Jed struck a match. "This should keep them busy," he said, touching flame to paper. The dry documents caught immediately, smoke beginning to fill the room. "Stay low. Follow me." They crept down the back stairs as shouts erupted from the street. "Fire! Fire in Graves' office!" Confusion spread among the men outside, several rushing toward the front entrance as flames became visible through the windows. Jed and Annabelle reached the back door, pausing in the shadows. "When I move, you run for those barrels," Jed instructed, pointing to a stack of rainwater barrels 20 yards away. "Don't stop until you reach them." Annabelle gripped the saddlebag containing the python tightly. "What about you?" "I'll be right behind you," he promised, readying his revolver. The 2 men guarding the alley had moved toward the commotion, their attention drawn to the growing fire. Jed squeezed Annabelle's shoulder, the signal to move. She darted from the doorway, running low and fast toward the barrels. One guard turned, spotting her movement, but Jed's carefully aimed shot knocked the man's hat from his head, sending him diving for cover. The second guard raised his rifle, but Annabelle had already reached the barrels. Jed fired twice more, forcing both men to take cover, then sprinted after her. "This way," he hissed, pulling her into the maze of Cheyenne's back alleys, the python secure in their possession. Dawn painted the mountain pass in stark contrasts of light and shadow as Jed and Annabelle urged their horses upward. They'd ridden through the night, stopping only to rest the animals, putting as much distance between themselves and Cheyenne as possible. "We should reach Hawk's cabin by nightfall," Jed said, scanning the trail ahead. The narrow passage squeezed between towering rock walls, leaving little room to maneuver, the perfect location for an ambush. Annabelle saw his concern. "Another way around?" "Not without adding 2 days' travel." Jed checked his Winchester. "We'll have to risk it." They proceeded cautiously, Jed leading, Annabelle following close behind. The silence was absolute. No birds, no insects, just the sound of their horses' hooves on stone. The first shot echoed through the pass without warning. Jed's horse reared as rock fragments exploded near its feet. He yanked Annabelle from her saddle as a second shot struck where she'd been sitting. "Ambush!" he shouted, pulling her behind a boulder as both horses bolted. Gunfire erupted from multiple positions above them. Jed counted at least 4 shooters positioned along the ridgeline. "Miller's smart," Jed muttered, returning fire with careful precision. "He predicted we'd take this route back." A bullet whined off the rock inches from Annabelle's head. She pressed herself flatter against the earth, the saddlebag with the python clutched protectively to her chest. "We can't stay here," she said. "They'll flank us." Jed nodded, impressed again by her quick grasp of their tactical situation. "See that outcropping?" He pointed to a cluster of boulders 30 yards downslope. "Better cover, and we might find a way around." Annabelle measured the distance with her eyes. "I'll draw their fire left, you go right." Before Jed could protest, she removed her hat, placed it on a stick, and thrust it out from behind their cover. Gunfire immediately concentrated on the decoy. "Now!" she called. They broke cover in opposite directions, bullets kicking up dust around them. Jed fired steadily as he ran, forcing the ambushers to duck. Annabelle reached the outcropping first, taking shelter behind a large boulder. A cry of pain told Jed one of his shots had found its mark. He slid into cover beside Annabelle, breathing hard. "You're bleeding," she said, pointing to his shoulder where a bullet had grazed him. "Just a scratch," he replied, reloading his revolver. "But they're between us and the horses." Annabelle's eyes glinted with determination. "Then we make them regret it." For the next hour, they played a deadly game of cat and mouse through the rocks, Jed's frontier experience matched by Annabelle's surprising resourcefulness. One by one, they eliminated their attackers, until only Miller remained. Miller's back pressed against a boulder, blood seeping from his arm where Jed's bullet had found him. His hat was gone, his ammunition nearly spent. "Give it up, Miller," Jed called from his position 20 yards away. "You're alone now." A bitter laugh echoed across the rocks. "You think this ends with me? Graves has men everywhere. That python you stole, it's worth more than gold to him." Annabelle had circled behind, her revolver trained on Miller's position. She caught Jed's eye, waiting for his signal. "Why's he so desperate to get it back?" Jed asked, keeping Miller distracted. "Because it's the only one," Miller replied, wincing as he shifted his wounded arm. "Made special by some craftsman back east. Without it, he can't forge new deeds that'll pass inspection." Jed nodded to Annabelle, who stepped into view behind Miller. "Drop your gun," she ordered, her voice steady. Miller froze, then slowly set his revolver down. "You're making a mistake, both of you. Graves owns half the territory. Judges, lawmen. You'll never—" "We already have," Jed interrupted, approaching cautiously. "The python plus Ellen's blood-stained deed is enough for the territorial judge in Laramie. He's outside Graves' influence." Miller's expression shifted, something like respect flashing in his eyes. "You got further than most," he admitted, "but Graves sent telegrams ahead when you left Cheyenne. By now, every man loyal to him knows where you're headed." "Where would that be?" Jed asked, binding Miller's hands with a leather strap. Miller smiled grimly. "Your ranch, Callahan. Where else would you go with your prize?" Jed and Annabelle exchanged alarmed glances. If Graves' men were heading to the ranch, Hawk might be in danger. They left Miller tied securely to a tree with enough water to survive until other travelers found him. As they recovered their horses and resumed their journey, a new urgency drove them. The python was secure, but the cost of their victory remained to be seen. Smoke rose above the trees long before Jed's ranch came into view. His heart sank as they crested the final ridge, revealing the devastation below. The ranch house stood in charred ruins, barn timbers still smoldering in the afternoon sun. Cattle had been driven off or slaughtered, their carcasses dotting the pasture. "No," Annabelle whispered beside him, her voice breaking. Jed spurred his horse forward, scanning for any sign of Hawk. The old scout had planned to return to the ranch after leading Ruby to safety, preparing it as a temporary haven while they journeyed to the judge. Near the remains of the corral, Jed found him. Hawk lay partially hidden beneath a fallen beam, blood matting his gray-streaked hair. For a terrible moment, Jed thought his friend was dead. Then Hawk's eyes fluttered open. "Took you long enough," he rasped. Jed knelt beside him, quickly assessing the injuries. A bullet wound in his side, badly burned arm, but alive. "Graves' men?" he asked, already knowing the answer. Hawk nodded weakly. 8 riders, left me alive, to deliver a message. He gripped Jed's arm with surprising strength. "They know about the judge in Laramie. Said they'd be waiting." Annabelle joined them, her face pale with shock. "What do we do now?" Jed looked from his burning ranch to his wounded friend to the woman who had risked everything for justice. "We get Hawk to town for treatment," he said grimly. "Then we finish this." Darkness had fallen by the time they reached Elk Creek, Hawk's blood soaking the makeshift stretcher dragged behind Jed's horse. The old scout drifted in and out of consciousness, his breathing growing more labored with each passing hour. "We need the doctor," Jed said, as they approached the town's edge, "but Graves will have men watching." "I'll go," Annabelle decided, straightening her shoulders. "They're looking for a woman with a branded thigh, not a confident lady in a proper dress." From saddlebags salvaged from the ranch ruins, she extracted a simple dress Ruby had provided. Behind a stand of trees, she transformed herself, hair pinned up beneath a modest bonnet, posture shifting to the straight-backed carriage of her Eastern upbringing. "Perfect," Jed acknowledged, tucking the python deeper into his coat. "Dr. Mansfield's office is on Pine Street. Tell him it's a gunshot wound, nothing more." "Be careful," she warned, touching his arm briefly before walking purposefully toward town. Jed moved Hawk to a sheltered hollow near the creek, doing what he could to stabilize the wound. "Stay with me, old friend," he murmured, pressing a fresh cloth against the bleeding. Hawk's eyes opened, surprisingly clear. "Should have seen them coming," he whispered. "You're worth 10 of Graves' men," Jed replied, checking the bandages. "We got the python. We'll make this right." A bitter smile crossed Hawk's weathered face. "Some fights? Can't be won, Jed." "This one can," Jed insisted, though doubt gnawed at his certainty. His ranch destroyed, his oldest friend dying, and Graves' men waiting in Laramie, the path to justice narrowed with each passing hour. Hoofbeats approached through the darkness. Jed drew his revolver, then relaxed as Annabelle appeared with Dr. Mansfield in tow, his medical bag clutched tightly. "Quickly," the doctor urged, kneeling beside Hawk. "We need to get him to my surgery before it's too late." Rain fell in gentle sheets outside Dr. Mansfield's window as Jed watched Hawk's chest rise and fall beneath clean bandages. The doctor had extracted the bullet and treated the burns, but his expression remained grave. "He's strong," Mansfield said quietly, washing blood from his hands, "but he's lost a lot of blood. The next few hours will tell." Annabelle sat beside the bed, her fingers gently holding Hawk's weathered hand. She'd helped the doctor throughout the surgery, her father's lessons proving invaluable. "You should rest," Jed told her, though he knew he wouldn't sleep himself. "So should you," she countered, her eyes reflecting the lamplight. When the doctor left to check on another patient, Jed moved to the window, scanning the street below. 2 men lingered outside the saloon across the way, their attention fixed on the doctor's office. "Graves' men," he murmured. "They know we're here." "Then why haven't they come for us?" Annabelle asked. "They're waiting, watching, making sure we feel trapped." Jed's hand went to his coat pocket, feeling the cylindrical shape of the python. It would be simple to give them what they want. End this. Annabelle rose from her chair, coming to stand beside him. "Is that what Ellen would want? What Hawk fought for?" Jed turned to look at her, really look at her. The brand on her thigh remained hidden beneath her dress, but its presence marked everything: her courage, her determination, her refusal to remain property. 3 years I've hidden from the world, he said softly. Built walls, kept to myself. And for what? Ellen's still dead. Justice hasn't been served. And now? She asked. Jed stared at his reflection in the rain-streaked glass, barely recognizing the man looking back at him. Now, I wonder if anything we do matters. Graves owns judges, lawmen, businessmen. We're just two people with a metal cylinder. Two people who refuse to be owned, Annabelle corrected, her voice gaining strength. Sometimes, that's enough to change everything. Morning light filtered through lace curtains as Jed dozed in a chair beside Hawk's bed. A knock at the door startled him awake, hand moving instinctively to his revolver. "It's Martha Wilkins," Annabelle whispered, recognizing the general store owner through the window. She opened the door cautiously. Martha slipped inside, her eyes darting nervously to the street before she closed the door. "Ruby told me you were back," she said, removing her shawl, "with evidence against Graves." Jed nodded, studying the woman whose husband had died, questioning Graves's deeds. "We have the python, his forgery tool. But we need to reach the judge in Laramie, and Graves' men are waiting for us." "Not just in Laramie," Martha replied. "They're gathering in town now. Miller returned this morning, told them you have the python." Annabelle sank into a chair, the weight of their situation settling on her shoulders. "We're trapped." A new voice joined the conversation. "Not necessarily." Felix Murray stood in the doorway, connecting to the doctor's back room, wiping ink from his fingers. The wiry printer had arrived at dawn with supplies for the doctor. "I couldn't help overhearing," Felix continued, approaching with cautious excitement. "You have the actual forgery device, the one that makes the seal on Graves's deeds?" Jed withdrew the python from his coat, holding the metal cylinder carefully. "This is it." Felix's eyes widened behind wire-rimmed spectacles. "May I?" He took the python reverently, examining it under the lamplight. Extraordinary craftsmanship. The detail in the pattern is remarkable. He looked up, a spark of realization in his eyes. "Do you know what this means? This isn't just evidence of forgery, it's proof of murder." "How?" Annabelle asked, leaning forward. "Because I can prove when this was made," Felix explained, pointing to tiny maker's marks on the cylinder's edge, "and match it precisely to the documents in question, including," he added with growing excitement, "your wife's blood-stained deed." Hawk's voice, weak but determined, came from the bed. "Then we don't need Laramie. We make our stand here." Jed felt something shift inside him, the weight of doubt giving way to purpose. Sometimes the darkest hour came just before dawn. Dr. Mansfield's back office had become their war room by midday. Maps of the town and surrounding territory covered a wooden table, weighted down by medical texts. Felix Murray hunched over the python with a jeweler's loupe, making detailed sketches of its intricate pattern. 6 clear identifying marks, he explained, displaying his drawings. The genuine territorial seal has none of these. Any document with these marks is definitively a forgery. Martha Wilkins spread out a ledger book rescued from her husband's possessions. Thomas kept records of every property transfer in the county for 15 years. These 12, she said, marking pages with scraps of paper, changed hands after owners mysteriously died or were forced to sell under unusual circumstances. Jed studied the pattern emerging on the map. Graves isn't just taking random properties. He's securing all land with water access. He traced the route of Highland Creek with his finger. Control the water, control the territory. "He's planning something bigger," Annabelle added, pointing to a notation in Martha's ledger. These property transfers all happened after the railroad survey came through last year. Ruby arrived with food and fresh bandages, slipping in through the back entrance. Graves' men are watching the doctor's office, but they haven't made a move. Miller's organizing them at the saloon. How many? Jed asked. 15, maybe more arriving. They're waiting for something. Ruby glanced at Hawk, whose color had improved slightly. Word is, Graves himself is coming from Cheyenne tomorrow. Good, Jed said with quiet determination. We'll be ready for him. Ready how? Martha asked, anxiety creeping into her voice. We're outnumbered, and the sheriff won't help us. Jed looked around the room at the unlikely allies gathered together, a printer, a storekeeper, a saloon owner, an injured scout, and a woman who refused to remain property. We have something Graves doesn't, he said. People who know the truth and aren't afraid to stand for it. From his bed, Hawk managed a wry smile. So, and a few who know how to shoot straight. Evening shadows lengthened as Felix completed his analysis of the python and the blood-stained deed. Annabelle worked alongside him, her neat handwriting filling pages with documented evidence. It's conclusive, Felix announced, setting down his magnifying glass. The pattern on Ellen's deed matches the python exactly, including these 3 unique imperfections. He pointed to barely visible marks on the metal cylinder. Any judge would accept this as evidence. Assuming we reach a judge, Ruby said pragmatically, peering through the curtains at the men still watching the building. Jed spread the town map across the table. Tomorrow when Graves arrives, he'll expect us to be cornered here. Instead, we bring the evidence to him, publicly. You want a confrontation? Dr. Mansfield asked, looking up from changing Hawk's bandages. I want justice, Jed replied, in front of witnesses. Graves thinks he owns this town, but there are still good people here who'll stand against him if they see the truth. Martha nodded slowly. Sunday service tomorrow. Everyone will be at the church, even those who normally avoid it. Perfect, Annabelle said, understanding immediately. We present the evidence in front of the entire town. Even Graves wouldn't risk violence in a church. The door opened unexpectedly, causing everyone to tense. Deputy James Ryder stepped inside, closing it quickly behind him. His young face was drawn with worry beneath his badge. You shouldn't be here, Ruby warned, hand moving to the small derringer in her pocket. I know, Ryder admitted, removing his hat, but you need to hear this. Graves isn't coming to talk. He's coming to kill everyone in this room and burn the evidence. He swallowed hard. He's bringing 20 men. They plan to surround the doctor's office at dawn and set fire to it, blame it on a lamp accident. Silence fell as they absorbed this information. Why tell us? Jed asked, studying the young deputy carefully. Because my badge used to mean something, Ryder answered simply. And I'm tired of pretending it doesn't. Stars still dotted the sky as final preparations were made. Through the doctor's back window, Jed watched the eastern horizon for the first hint of dawn, and with it, Graves's attack. Everyone clear on the plan? He asked, checking his revolver one last time. Nods circled the room. Martha and Felix would take the evidence to Judge Pierce's home outside town, accompanied by Deputy Ryder. The judge's reputation for integrity made him their best hope for official action. Once you have the judge's protection, send word to the territorial marshal in Laramie, Jed instructed. We need law that Graves doesn't control. Ruby would create a diversion at her saloon, drawing attention from their escape. Dr. Mansfield would remain with Hawk, ready to treat any injuries, and Jed and Annabelle would do the most dangerous part, ride directly to Graves' ranch outside town. You don't have to come, Jed told Annabelle as they prepared to leave. "You've done more than enough already." She adjusted the gun belt Ruby had given her, checking that the revolver sat properly. "My brand is evidence too," she said simply, "and I want to see his face when he realizes he no longer owns anything, especially not me." Deputy Ryder returned from his patrol, breathless. "Graves just arrived with more men. They're gathering on Main Street right now, at least 30 guns." "Change of plans," Jed decided immediately. "They'll be watching all the roads. We need to move now, before first light." Hawk pushed himself up from his bed, grimacing with pain. "Help me up," he ordered. "I'll cover your escape from the upper window." "You can barely stand," Dr. Mansfield protested. "Don't need to stand to shoot," Hawk replied with grim humor. As they made final preparations, Jed took Annabelle's hand briefly in his. "Whatever happens," he said quietly, "thank you for bringing me back to life." Her fingers tightened around his. "We're not done living yet." Outside, the first hint of dawn touched the eastern sky as they prepared to make their stand. First light painted the horizon in shades of gold and crimson as Jed and Annabelle approached Graves's ranch. The sprawling two-story house stood like a monument to wealth amassed through others' suffering, its windows still dark in the early dawn. "Remember," Jed said quietly as they dismounted in a copse of trees, "we're just buying time for the others to reach Judge Pierce." Annabelle nodded, her face composed despite the danger. The brand on her thigh seemed to burn anew with proximity to the man who'd marked her. I remember." They made their way to the house on foot, using the shadows of outbuildings for cover. No guards patrolled the grounds. Graves's men were in town, preparing to eliminate the evidence and anyone connected to it. The back door yielded to Jed's careful manipulation. They slipped inside, moving through the silent kitchen into the main house. The opulence was immediate and jarring. Imported furniture, expensive paintings, crystal decanters filled with amber liquor. "His office is upstairs," Annabelle whispered, leading the way with the confidence of someone who knew the house well. At the top of the stairs, light spilled from beneath a door. Voices drifted through the wood, one deep and commanding, the other deferential. Jed recognized Miller's distinctive drawl. "Should be handled by now," Miller was saying. "Doctor's office surrounded. No one gets out alive." "And the python?" The commanding voice could only belong to Marcus Graves. "Either destroyed in the fire or recovered. Either way, the problem ends today." Jed and Annabelle exchanged glances. Graves didn't know that the evidence was already on its way to Judge Pierce, or that his planned massacre would find an empty doctor's office. Jed drew his revolver and nodded to Annabelle. It was time to face the man who had taken everything from both of them. With a swift kick, he burst through the door into Graves' sanctum. Marcus Graves looked exactly as power personified should. Tall, imposing, immaculately dressed even at dawn, with silver threading through his dark hair and cold eyes that assessed threats with clinical precision. His hand moved toward a desk drawer as Jed and Annabelle entered, but froze at the sight of Jed's aimed revolver. "Mr. Callahan," Graves said smoothly, recovering his composure, "and my missing property." "How convenient to have you both deliver yourselves to me." "I belong to no one," Annabelle stated, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. Miller reached for his gun, but Jed's warning shot splintered the desk inches from his fingers. "Don't," Jed advised quietly. Graves leaned back in his leather chair, studying them with the detached interest of a man accustomed to viewing people as commodities. "I assume you've come to negotiate. The python, for your lives, perhaps?" "We're not here to negotiate," Jed replied. The python, Ellen's blood-stained deed, and a dozen forged documents are already on their way to Judge Pierce, along with testimony about my wife's murder and Annabelle's branding. For the first time, uncertainty flickered across Graves's face. Pierce is one judge. I own 10 others. Perhaps, Annabelle acknowledged. But can you own the territorial governor once the evidence becomes public? Or the newspapers in Denver and Chicago when they learn a man is branding women as property in Wyoming territory? Miller looked to his employer, waiting for direction. Graves's expression hardened as he realized the extent of their plan. "You've impressed me," he admitted. "Few have caused me this much inconvenience, but my men are still prepared to burn the doctor's office with all your friends inside. One word from me stops that order." "Your men will find an empty building," Jed informed him, "and a town no longer afraid to stand against you." Rage transformed Graves's face. With surprising speed, he yanked open his desk drawer and raised a derringer. Jed fired simultaneously, his bullet striking Graves's shoulder, spinning him backward. Miller drew his revolver, only to feel Annabelle's gun pressing against his temple. "Don't," she echoed Jed's earlier warning. Graves clutched his bleeding shoulder, hatred burning in his eyes. "You think this changes anything?" "I built an empire. One setback." "This isn't a setback," Jed interrupted, moving to secure Graves's weapon. "This is justice." Outside, hoofbeats approached rapidly. Not the sound of rescue for Graves, but Deputy Ryder leading Judge Pierce and several armed townsmen up the drive. Through the window, Jed watched the sunrise illuminate the land, Ellen's land, now his again, as Graves's empire crumbled in the morning light. 3 weeks later, Jed stood on his newly rebuilt porch, watching the sunset paint the distant mountains. The ranch house wasn't complete, but it had a roof and walls again. Cattle once more grazed in the north pasture, some donated by neighbors who'd also suffered under Graves's schemes. Judge Pierce had moved swiftly once presented with the evidence. Marcus Graves now awaited trial in the territorial prison, his financial empire dismantled piece by forged piece. Miller and several others had turned evidence against their former employer in exchange for leniency. The sound of a wagon approaching drew Jed's attention. Annabelle sat at the reins, bringing supplies from town. In the weeks since Graves' arrest, she'd stayed to help rebuild, her determination and intelligence proving as valuable in construction as they had in pursuit of justice. "The territorial marshal sent a telegram," she called as she pulled the wagon to a stop. "They found 3 more victims of Graves's brandings in Colorado. They're bringing them as witnesses for the trial." Jed helped her down from the wagon, their hands lingering together longer than necessary. "You could testify, too," he said carefully, "if you wanted." Annabelle looked toward the house, its framework rising from the ashes of what had been destroyed. "I could," she agreed. "Or I could stay and help finish this." "The house?" "The life," she clarified, meeting his eyes steadily. "Yours, mine. Perhaps ours." From inside came Hawk's distinctive laugh as he shared stories with Ruby and Felix, who'd ridden out to help with the raising of the barn wall. Martha would arrive tomorrow with more volunteers from town. "I'd like that," Jed said softly, his hand finding hers again. Annabelle smiled, looking out over the land that was healing just as they were. "Some marks never fade," she said, her free hand brushing her thigh where the brand remained. "But we choose what they mean now." Together they walked toward the house, where friends waited and new foundations were taking root, in wood and earth and heart. "Well, friend, we've ridden a long trail together through the Wyoming territory of 1885, where human flesh could be branded with ownership claims, while the land itself was stolen through forged papers. If you're feeling a bit weathered from the journey, Jed's isolation, Annabelle's courage, the fires of destruction and rebuilding, I understand completely. Telling their story has left marks on me too, as surely as witnessing justice unfold has marked you. There's something about the frontier that strips away pretense and reveals what truly matters. Jed spent 3 years hiding from the world after Ellen's death, believing walls would protect what remained of his heart. Annabelle survived being branded as property, her dignity assaulted but never truly taken. Both carried visible and invisible scars, yet neither was defined by them in the end. That's the thing about marks upon our lives. Their meaning changes when we claim the right to interpret them ourselves. What struck me most, while following Jed and Annabelle's journey, was how healing came not from vengeance, but connection. The Python tool that created false ownership documents became evidence of truth. The brand meant to claim Annabelle instead became proof of Graves's corruption. Even Jed's burned ranch rose again through community hands, stronger for having been tested by fire. Sometimes what's taken from us creates space for something we never imagined possible. Writing about Wyoming Territory justice reminded me how dignity remains a battlefield in every era. We may not face land barons with branding irons today, but people still attempt to claim ownership over others, through economic power, through manipulation, through legal maneuvering. Jed and Annabelle's stand against such ownership echoes whenever someone reclaims their voice, their autonomy, their right to self-definition. In the end, both Jed and Annabelle learned what the frontier has always taught those brave enough to face it. We are not owned by our worst experiences, but liberated by how we respond to them. Some marks never fade, but we choose what they mean now, one courageous day at a time. Thank you for riding this trail with me. Stories only truly live when they find hearts willing to witness healing in the face of harm, justice rising from injustice. Your willingness to follow Jed and Annabelle from branded flesh to free spirits transforms these words into something that matters beyond the page. Jed and Annabelle's story got me thinking about the marks we all carry, some visible, some hidden deep. We've all experienced moments when someone tried to define us by their terms, tried to own a piece of our dignity or spirit. What's your story of reclaiming something that was rightfully yours, your voice, your confidence, your path forward? Share in the comments, because these journeys of self-reclamation deserve to be honored. If this tale of branded flesh and frontier justice stirred something in you, I'd be grateful if you'd hit that like button and consider subscribing. The Wyoming Territory is rich with stories of people defining themselves beyond the marks others left on them, and I'd be honored to share more with you. Until next time, may you own your story, never be owned by it.